She was on her knees on the wet Portland stone steps when she understood that it was no accident. The wine, a dark burgundy, still warm from the heated ballroom, had struck the back of her ivory gown in a single, deliberate arc, drenching the Flemish lace from shoulder to hem until the fabric clung to her spine like something alive. She had turned. She had seen only the shifting wall of masked faces in the lit doorway above her, some laughing behind their lacquered masks, some perfectly still, one woman pressing a gloved hand to her mouth in a gesture that could not be distinguished from horror or from satisfaction. 300 candles blazed in the chandelier behind them, throwing gold light down the grand staircase and onto the rain-slicked stone below. The March rain had been falling for an hour already. It struck her bare shoulders and the ruined roses in her hair and spread the burgundy stain outward in slow, wet fingers across the ivory silk. Evangeline Morrow, the Duchess of Ravenscroft for 31 months, the most discussed woman in England, the woman that high society had resolved to destroy, did not move. She breathed in through her nose. Out through her mouth. She did not reach up to wipe the wine from her neck. She rose. Welcome to the Duke's shadow, we are so glad you are here. Before we go any further, we want to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your city or your country in the comments below, we read every single one. If this story moves you even a little, please give us a like and subscribe to the channel. We release new Victorian romance stories every week, and you will not want to miss what is coming. Now, back to the night that changed everything. The letter had been read 10 minutes earlier, while she was still inside. Lord Phineas Wycliffe had stood at the foot of the grand staircase in his crimson half-mask and read it in the leisurely voice of a man delivering an after-dinner anecdote, each word shaped with care, each pause placed where it would cause the most damage. The ballroom smelled of hothouse lilies and hot candle wax and the particular close heat of 300 people in formal dress, and the rustle of silk as guests leaned toward one another was the loudest sound in the room, because everyone else had gone absolutely silent. The letter alleged that Evangeline, before her elevation, had been known throughout the merchant circles of Bristol as a woman of calculated ambition, that she had pursued the Duke with deliberate patience, had fabricated the circumstances of their first encounter, and had deceived a great and honorable man into an unsuitable marriage for the sole purpose of securing his title and his fortune. Wycliffe read it without haste. He read it as though he were genuinely sorry to be the one delivering it. That performance of reluctance was the cruelest part of the entire evening, because it gave every person present permission to believe him. She had turned to Edmund the moment the first sentence left Wycliffe's mouth. Edmund Ashworth, the 7th Duke of Ravenscroft, stood not 20 feet away across the parquet floor, tall, broad-shouldered in his dark formal coat, the white satin of his cravat precise beneath his jaw, and he was looking back at her with the grey eyes that had always, until this season, given her the sensation of solid ground. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. And then, in what she would later consider the single most costly moment of his life, he looked away. But in that same terrible instant she noticed something she had not expected. He was holding, loosely, between his left thumb and forefinger, a folded square of paper that had not been in his hand 10 minutes prior. Someone had pressed it upon him during the reading. Someone had wanted him to hold something while he listened. She did not know yet what it contained. She did not know yet who had handed it to him. But the sight of it, that small, folded, deliberate thing, tightened something in her chest with a precision that fear alone could not have produced. This was arranged. Every element of this evening had been arranged. She walked out with the measured pace of a woman who will not be hurried by cruelty. The crowd parted. The great double doors of the portico opened, and the cold March air struck her face, and the rain did what it had been doing all evening, falling without opinion upon the guilty and the innocent alike. She walked down the wet stone steps to the street below and stood with the gas lamps making broken gold circles in the puddles at her feet and the coachmen watching from their high seats without expression. She reached inside her left glove, where Agnes Blackwell, her lady's maid, had pressed something during the top of the evening, pressed it in with urgent fingers and held her hand for one brief, fierce moment before releasing it. Agnes never wasted gestures. Evangeline unfolded the paper now. It was small, rain-softened at the edges, written in her maid's compact and reliable hand. She expected a warning. She expected a name, Silas Crabbe perhaps, or some new instrument of Lady Dorothea's design. She was wrong. What Agnes had written was not a name and not a warning. It was an address. Clough Fair, Clerkenwell. And beneath it, 3 words, he has confessed. 3 years before the wine fell across her gown, Bristol had smelled of the Avon at low tide and warm wool from the Corn Street warehouses, and Thomas Morrow had been alive. He was a cloth merchant of moderate prosperity and considerable warmth, The sort of man who kept maps on his walls and believed that industry and honesty were sufficient to construct any future a person cared to reach for. He had raised his only daughter on the twin pillars of education and candor, seen her through Cheltenham Ladies' College, and told her on the last evening they shared that a woman who could think clearly in a crisis would always outlast a woman who merely looked beautiful in one. He died in October of 1873, when the plane trees on the Avon Gorge were burning gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and ripening cider apples, and he left behind a beloved library, a warm reputation, and debts that consumed the Corn Street house within a fortnight of the funeral. Evangeline had stood in the empty drawing-room on the last morning, her hand flat against the stripped wallpaper where a map of the Atlantic trade routes had hung for as long as she could remember, and she had said goodbye not to a room but to an entire version of herself. Mrs. Harriet Morrow dismantled the household with the composure of a woman who had been quietly preparing herself for catastrophe since the first time she noticed worry lines forming behind her husband's eyes in the late evenings when he thought she was not watching. She arranged the sale of every piece of furniture herself, negotiated with each creditor in person, and took lodgings on Park Street before the month was out, a narrow, respectable house with a good piano in the front room and a small garden where the last of the autumn roses were clinging stubbornly to the wall. She found 3 families willing to pay for piano lessons before Christmas. She did not once describe herself as reduced, or ruined, or deserving of sympathy. She described herself as rearranged. It was she who had suggested, without sentiment, that Evangeline seek a position as a governess in the country. "The world will not hold its breath for you to finish grieving, my love," she had said one evening, folding the last of Thomas's maps with careful, unhurried hands. "It is best to be in motion when things begin to turn." Evangeline had taken her at her word and written 11 application letters in a single sitting by the light of the Park Street parlour fire. The position at Ravenscroft Manor had emerged through Mrs. Wainwright of Bath, who knew a housekeeper who knew a steward who knew that the 7th Duke of Yorkshire was seeking a governess for 2 young nieces placed in his care following a railway accident near Doncaster. The household steward administered a written examination by post, French composition, mathematics, and an essay question on the moral education of children, and Evangeline had answered it with the directness and genuine feeling that her father had always insisted was more valuable than cleverness. She had expected nothing. What she had not known, and would not discover until years later, when Edmund told her one winter evening with a quality in his voice that she would describe only as a man surprised by his own past self, was that there had been a second candidate, the daughter of a Northumberland baronet with impeccable bloodlines and a governess of considerable formal accomplishment. The household steward had recommended the baronet's daughter. Edmund had read both examination essays himself, which was irregular and entirely characteristic of him, and he had chosen Evangeline's on the basis of a single sentence in her moral education essay, a sentence he had apparently copied into a private notebook and kept. He never told her which sentence. She was too proud to ask. She arrived at Ravenscroft in January of 1875 on a morning of such absolute snow that the avenue of lime trees lining the long drive appeared to have been painted rather than grown, each branch perfectly white, perfectly still, the air between them faintly blue with cold, the gravel path beneath the hired carriage invisible under 12 inches of undisturbed fall. The house itself rose at the end of the avenue like something a serious-minded deity had placed there as a demonstration of purpose, a vast Palladian structure of Yorkshire stone, 3 stories high, its wings extending east and west, its chimneys numerous and perfectly proportioned, its front steps swept with such precision that she wondered, as she descended from the carriage into the fierce cold with her single trunk, whether the snow had been instructed to avoid them. The housekeeper, Mrs. Thorpe, a small, upright woman of 60 with the brisk and peaceable manner of someone who has successfully managed the domestic affairs of a large establishment for long enough to have made peace with every variety of human peculiarity, met her at the door with a cup of tea that had been prepared for exactly the right temperature. She was shown to her rooms. She sat by the window and looked out over the white park. Something in her chest set itself quietly into place. She met Amelia and Clara Ashworth the following morning in the schoolroom at the top of the west wing, a long, south-facing room with good light, a scarred oak work table, and the particular atmosphere of a space that has been occupied by children for generations without ever quite losing the overlapping traces of all their previous inhabitants. Amelia was 9, with her dead father's serious brown eyes and a gift for mental arithmetic. She had decided, as an act of private resistance toward every previous adult who had underestimated her, to conceal from all governesses on principle. Clara was 7, quieter and more openly afraid, and she kept a small embroidered handkerchief that had belonged to her mother pressed flat between the pages of her prayer book, pressed there not as a keepsake but as an anchor, something that could be verified in the dark. Evangeline saw the shape of their grief immediately. She did not rush it, explain it, or offer false assurance that it would pass quickly, because she understood with great personal certainty by then that it would not. She sat down at the work table between them and opened a book of maps. Clara looked at the maps. Then she looked up and said, in the clear voice of a child who repeats what she has heard without understanding yet why it matters, "Papa always said that Yorkshire sends the right person when you need one." Evangeline looked at her. "Then perhaps," she said gently, "it has." Edmund Ashworth arrived at Ravenscroft on a Tuesday in the first week of March, riding in from the north on a large bay horse with his only groom beside him and no advance notice sent to the house, because he disliked the particular theatre that advance notices created, the assembled staff in the entrance hall, the formal reception, the performance of welcome that everyone on both sides was obliged to sustain for a polite interval before the actual life of the household could resume. He dismounted in the stable yard in a riding coat of deep brown wool, already laughing at something his groom had said, a real laugh, unguarded, carrying no awareness of being observed, and it was in this state that he turned to find three people standing on the gravel drive at the yard's edge. His housekeeper Mrs. Thorpe, a dark-haired young woman in a grey wool walking dress whom he did not recognize, and Clara, who walked forward from between the two adults with the directness of a child, who has decided that social convention is less important than information and said, without preamble, "Are you Uncle Edmund?" He crouched to her height immediately, which Evangeline noticed, and filed away. He gave Clara his full, unhurried attention. "I am," he said. "And you must be Clara." It was the simplest possible exchange. It revealed everything she needed to know about him. The library at Ravenscroft occupied the entire south wing of the ground floor and contained over 6,000 volumes arranged with the affectionate disorder of a man who reads for genuine pleasure rather than display, history shelved beside novels, scientific texts beside poetry, a section of navigation charts that had clearly been consulted recently tucked between 2 volumes of parliamentary proceedings. Evangeline had found it on her third evening at the house, sleepless and unwilling to lie still in the dark, and she had taken a candle and gone downstairs and pushed open the unlocked door and stood in the long, cold room while her candle flame steadied itself and the shelves extended into the dimness in every direction. She was on the rolling library ladder reaching for the third volume of Gibbon's Decline and Fall, which she had noticed on her first morning and been thinking about with some urgency ever since, when a voice from below said, without alarm and without the slight condescension she had learned to expect from men of this household standing, "You shall need both hands for that one. It runs to 6 volumes. She looked down. Edmund was standing at the foot of the ladder in his shirt sleeves with a candle of his own and an expression of genuine interest. "I am aware," she replied. "I intend to start with the third." A pause. Then he said, with real pleasure, "So do I." They met in the library on 4 consecutive evenings before either of them named what the meetings were. He brought wine on the third evening, a quiet claret in 2 plain glasses, no ceremony, and they sat on opposite sides of the central table and read in the comfortable silence of people who do not need to fill the air between them. He spoke to her without the faint condescension that men of his position habitually extended toward women they considered socially inferior, that particular performance of generosity that is really a continuous reminder of distance. He spoke to her as he spoke to Sir Aldous Pemberton, his closest friend, or to the members of his agricultural committee, as though the person across the table had thoughts worth hearing. She found it disconcerting in the specific way that being treated as an equal is disconcerting when one has spent years preparing carefully for the alternative. On the 4th evening, he asked her opinion of Gibbon's treatment of the Eastern Empire, and she answered him with the full and precise depth of what she actually thought, not the measured, careful fraction that women in her position were generally expected to contribute. And he listened with both elbows on the table, his face turned entirely toward hers, and when she had finished he sat in silence for a moment, and then he said, "Yes. Exactly that." She felt something shift in the room. It did not shift back. The proposal came in May, when the park was full in summer leaf and the horse chestnuts stood white against the green and the air through the open schoolroom windows smelled of warm earth and cut grass and the first roses beginning to open on the south wall. He asked her to walk with him in the long evening light, which struck her as slightly unusual, since he generally walked alone, and they followed the gravel path east until they reached the old stone bench near the garden gate, where a climbing rose of old ivory was opening its first flowers of the season against the warm stone of the wall. He did not approach the matter obliquely. He told her, in language that was plain and measured and cost him something visible to say, that he respected her intelligence and her character and her extraordinary tenderness with his nieces, and that beyond all of these admirable and observable qualities, he had discovered in her company a quality of contentment that 34 years of his particular life had not managed to produce anywhere else. He wished to marry her, if she would permit it. He said it while looking directly at her face, without the evasion or false modesty that often decorated such declarations. Then he stopped and waited. She looked at the ivory rose opening in the warm evening air. She thought of her father's maps. She said yes. Sir Aldous Pemberton received the news of Edmund's engagement with outward warmth and inward calculation in the precise proportion one would expect from a man who loves his friend completely and also possesses a first-class legal mind. He congratulated Edmund without qualification and then waited 3 days before presenting, with the diplomatic precision he brought to every matter of genuine importance, his considered analysis of the social terrain ahead. Society, he explained, would not receive Miss Morrow graciously. The established order operated by a logic as immovable as load-bearing masonry, and a merchant's daughter, however accomplished, however clearly loved, represented a disruption to the calculus of title and bloodline that had sustained the entire structure for generations. There would be cruelty, he said. There would be organized resistance. Edmund heard all of this with patient attention. Then Sir Aldous said the thing he had been saving, that Lady Dorothea Pelhamstoke had written to Edmund on 2 separate occasions over the preceding year, 2 letters, carefully composed, advancing the case for a marriage between the Duke and her daughter Constance. Edmund had not replied to either letter. "Did you intend to?" Sir Aldous asked. "No," Edmund said. "Then she already knows," Sir Aldous replied. "And she has been preparing accordingly." He paused. "I do not think, Edmund, that she is a woman who accepts a non-reply graciously." They were married on the 14th of August, 1875, in the small Norman church on the eastern edge of the Ravenscroft estate, in a ceremony attended by the household staff, Sir Aldous Pemberton, Mrs. Harriet Morrow, and Amelia and Clara, who sat together in the front pew in white muslin dresses and held each other's hands throughout with the solemn grip of children taking something seriously. The sky above Yorkshire that morning was the particular shade of deep, honest blue that appears perhaps twice in an English summer, a blue belonging to a different country, a more generous one, and the amber glass of the old church windows threw patterns of warm gold across the flagstone floor and along the hem of Evangeline's cream silk dress, which she had chosen without ornamentation beyond her mother's strand of seed pearls, because she wanted nothing about the day to be performed. Edmund looked at her the moment she appeared in the church doorway and did not look away once during the entire ceremony. She felt, walking the length of that small nave with the smell of old stone and fresh flowers and warm candle wax surrounding her, that she was walking not toward a ceremony but toward something irrevocable and right. She was not afraid. She had never been less afraid of anything in her life. She took his hand at the altar and held it with a steadiness that surprised even herself. London received the notice of the Duke's marriage with the particular collective disposition of a drawing-room in which an unpleasant subject has been introduced that no one will address directly but everyone intends to address the moment the offending party withdraws. The announcement appeared in the Times on the 17th of August, and within 48 hours, the verdict of society had been communicated through every morning room and gentlemen's club in Mayfair with the efficiency of a well-organized postal service. Lady Dorothea Pelhamstoke read the notice at her breakfast table in Grosvenor Square, set the paper down with a precision that indicated deep rather than absent feeling, and said nothing for 3 full minutes while her daughter Constance sat opposite with untouched toast. But what Lady Dorothea did not know, what she would not know for some time, was that the expression on Constance's face in that breakfast room was not grief. It was relief. Constance Pelhamstoke had been quietly, privately, and with no expectation of resolution in love with a young naval lieutenant named Frederick Aldgate for the better part of 2 years, a man of honor and no fortune, a man whose existence she had never once mentioned to her mother, a man whose letters she kept in the lining of her Sunday hat. The Duke of Ravenscroft had been her mother's ambition. He had never been her own. Ashworth House in Belgrave Square opened for the winter season in October, and the city that Edmund had known all his adult life had rearranged itself imperceptibly but absolutely around the fact of Evangeline's presence. He saw it first in the invitations that arrived with only his name on the envelope, small omissions, each one deniable, collectively a statement. He saw it in the morning callers who received his wife with the punctilious courtesy that Lady Dorothea's circle had perfected over decades, the warmth that was entirely surface, the inquiries about her health delivered in tones that communicated, through their very solicitude, a categorical distance. He saw it in the way his mother's oldest friends, women who had danced at his parents' anniversary celebrations and wept at his parents' funerals, greeted Evangeline with a particular smile he had not encountered before and recognized at once, the smile offered to a person one has already decided one will never truly admit. Evangeline bore all of it with a composure so sustained and so complete that it occasionally disturbed him, not because he doubted her but because he understood what that kind of composure costs. One evening in November she came down for dinner in a gown of dark blue silk and he looked at her across the dinner table and felt, with sudden and acute clarity, that he had not yet done enough to deserve her. The dinner at the Earl and Countess of Hexham's townhouse in November was the first significant social engagement of the season, and the seating arrangement communicated its intentions within moments of the first course arriving. Evangeline was placed between a general who was deaf in both ears and a viscount who spent the first 3 courses directing every remark exclusively to the woman on his left, turning his shoulder to Evangeline with the deliberate geometry of a man who has been instructed in the precise social message he is required to convey. She ate with composure. She responded to the general's fragments of conversation with genuine warmth. She looked at the floral centerpiece when the viscount's silence became pointed enough to acknowledge. And she waited. By the 4th course, a woman seated directly opposite, a sharp-faced, intelligent widow named Mrs. Blanche Horsley, who wrote for the Ladies' Magazine under a nom de plume and had been watching the new Duchess all evening with the focused attention of a professional rather than a guest, leaned forward and asked her opinion of Mr. Hardy's far from the madding crowd. Evangeline answered with such enthusiasm and such pleasingly unexpected precision that the conversation spread around the table like warmth from a newly lit fire. Mrs. Horsley smiled across the floral arrangement with the private satisfaction of a woman who has just confirmed a hypothesis she found pleasing. One genuine ally, Evangeline noted, was worth cataloguing with care. The anonymous letters began arriving in December, plain paper, careful hands, posted to Ashworth House and to 2 of Edmund's club correspondents, making allegations about Evangeline's past that were sufficiently vague to evade libel while sufficiently specific to suggest credibility. Nothing was provable. Nothing needed to be. In the social ecosystem of London's haute monde, a rumor required only plausibility and repetition to achieve the force of established fact. Edmund showed her one in the library at Ashworth House on a Wednesday evening. She read it without visible reaction and was about to set it down when something on the envelope caught her attention. She brought the candle closer and looked at the postmark. London. The letter claimed to originate from a Bristol acquaintance. It bore a London postmark. She turned the envelope over, and then she looked at her own name written on the front, and the cold that moved through her in that moment had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The handwriting on the envelope was not quite her own. It was not close enough to deceive someone who knew her hand well, but it was constructed with deliberate reference to the particular slant and spacing of her script. Someone had studied how she wrote. Someone had access to her correspondence. She set the envelope down. She looked at Edmund. "We have someone in the household," she said. The Silas Crabbe rumor arrived in December of 1875 with the quiet, calculated ferocity of something that has been prepared with care before being released into the right conditions. The name had been heard, allegedly, in the card room of a Mayfair club that was never quite specified, a textile factor from Bristol's Redcliffe district who had spoken, with apparently vivid confidence, of an intimate prior acquaintance with a certain young woman lately elevated to a dukedom. The details were never stated plainly. In certain social circles, insinuation is more destructive than accusation because it cannot be directly refuted. It exists inside the imagination of each listener, taking the precise shape of whatever that listener is most prepared to believe. Within a fortnight the rumor had moved through every significant drawing room in Mayfair, gathering texture and elaboration with each retelling. What had begun as a second-hand claim from an unspecified card room had become, in the mouths of some, a thoroughly documented affair known to Bristol society at large. In the mouths of others it remained merely an uneasy cloud that had settled above Ashworth House and refused to disperse. Evangeline heard it first not from Edmund but from Mrs. Horsley, who delivered the information directly and without theatrical distress, as was her nature. "It is a name," Mrs. Horsley said. "And names can be verified." "Or disproven," Evangeline replied. "Exactly," said Mrs. Horsley. Edmund heard it from Lord Phineas Wycliffe at his club on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered with the slow reluctance of a man performing sympathy for a close friend. Edmund thanked him briefly and came home changed in a way that was invisible to everyone in the household except Evangeline, who could read the temperature of his silences the way she read the Yorkshire weather from the colour of the afternoon sky, not from what was said but from the particular quality of what was not. He was courteous at dinner. He was attentive during the evening. But something behind his grey eyes had not been there that morning, a specific quality of internal re-examination, a barely visible recalibration, and she felt it settle over her chest like a cold and unfamiliar weight. She did not question him that night. She waited until the next morning, when Agnes appeared at her dressing table with information more useful than any question could have produced. Agnes had seen Lord Wycliffe in conversation, 2 days prior in the Piccadilly Arcade, with a man she recognized from Ashworth House, Mr. Arthur Hartwell, Edmund's private secretary, who had been in the Duke's employ for 3 years and whom no one had previously found any reason to distrust. Agnes had not yet seen what passed between them. But she had seen Wycliffe give Hartwell something small. And she had seen Hartwell put it immediately inside his coat. She wrote to Bristol that same morning, 2 letters, both dispatched before noon. One to her mother, requesting a candid account of any connection, however distant, with a man named Silas Crabbe, cloth factor of the Redcliffe district. One to Mrs. Wainwright in Bath, asking the same. Both replies arrived within 6 days. Mrs. Harriet Morrow had never heard the name Silas Crabbe. Mrs. Wainwright had not heard it either. Mrs. Morrow, with the characteristic thoroughness that had carried her through the dismantling of the Corn Street house, had additionally made inquiries among 3 remaining Bristol acquaintances with connections to the Redcliffe trade, and none of them had been able to locate any textile factor of that name in the district at all, or in the city, or in the county. He did not exist. Evangeline set both letters on her writing desk and studied the space between them. The absence of a real Silas Crabbe was not a comfort. It was a confirmation of something considerably more alarming than an actual man could have represented. Someone had invented him. Had given him a name plausible enough to circulate, a trade credible enough to verify superficially, and a story tailored precisely to the specific wound that would cause the most damage. This was not improvised. This was architecture. Patient, careful, deliberate architecture designed by someone who understood, in intimate detail, exactly what would hurt. She told him on Sunday, in the library, with the afternoon light coming grey through the tall windows and the coals settling quietly in the fireplace behind them. She told him plainly, that she had no knowledge of any such man, that she had confirmed through her mother and Mrs. Wainwright that no such man appeared to exist in Bristol's Redcliffe trade, and that she wanted him to know this not as a defense but as a fact. She placed her mother's letter on the table between them and waited. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke it was with the particular honesty of a man who has decided that the discomfort of the truth is preferable to the greater discomfort of its avoidance. He said that he had not believed it. He said that for approximately 1 day he had doubted, and that the doubt had shamed him considerably. She told him there was no need for shame in the doubt itself, that doubt was the natural human response to an accusation delivered by a man presenting himself as a friend, and that she would have been more troubled if he had felt nothing. He looked at her for a moment. He said, "You are more generous with my weaknesses than I deserve." She said, "I am not being generous. I am being accurate. There is a difference." He almost smiled. It was not quite the right moment for smiling. But it was close. She was walking in Hyde Park the following Saturday in the brittle December light, the bare plane trees standing black-armed above the frost-hardened path and the smell of cold mud and coal smoke drifting from the Park Lane direction, when Agnes said, in the level tone she reserved for matters of real significance, "I have now observed Lord Wycliffe in conversation with Mr. Hartwell on 3 separate occasions. Piccadilly, once. The mews behind Grosvenor Square, once. And here in this park, 2 Tuesdays past, on the path by the Serpentine. On the 3rd occasion, Hartwell was carrying a document case. He was not carrying it when they parted." Evangeline did not alter her pace. The cold air moved through the plane trees and touched the back of her neck above her collar. She said, "Thank you, Agnes. Pray continue watching." They walked in silence for a quarter-mile, the frost crunching beneath their boots, the park lying grey and bare around them under the low December sky. When they returned to Ashworth House, a slim envelope was waiting on the hall table among the afternoon's post, addressed in an unfamiliar hand, no return direction, marked in small neat capital letters, "For Her Grace only." She took it upstairs. She opened it alone with the sitting-room door bolted and Agnes standing guard in the corridor. The paper inside bore a single sentence. It read, "The man who wrote the forgeries lives at Cloth Fair, Clerkenwell. His name is Erasmus Quill. He has been paid a total of £60. She read the sentence 4 times. Then she turned the paper over. The reverse bore 3 additional lines, written with the same controlled precision, that the payments for the Crabbe rumour and for the forged correspondence had been arranged through Lord Phineas Wycliffe, who was in this matter acting on behalf of a principal he had known since childhood, a principal who would not appear in any record, who had never been present at any meeting with Erasmus Quill, and whose name therefore could not be produced by Mr. Quill in any formal proceeding, since Quill himself had never heard it spoken aloud. The note added that a second instrument was currently in preparation, the nature of which the writer did not specify, and that Evangeline had, in the writer's estimation, perhaps 3 weeks before it was deployed. She folded the paper and placed it in the concealed compartment of her writing box with the care she would give a legal document. She sat at her desk for a long, still moment with her hands flat on the leather surface, looking at the closed lid of the writing box, thinking. 3 things struck her with equal force. First, someone inside Lady Dorothea's circle had decided to warn her, which meant the methods being employed had begun to trouble at least one person involved in them. Second, Erasmus Quill could be found. Third, she had, perhaps, 3 weeks. She stood. She called for Agnes. She had work to do. She called at Grosvenor Square unannounced on Monday morning, because an unannounced call was the only call that did not give Lady Dorothea the advantage of preparation. She was received, one could not turn away a duchess without social consequence, and shown into the first-floor drawing-room with the formal courtesy that Lady Dorothea extended to every caller as a matter of principle, regardless of her private feelings about their visit. The room was magnificent in the particular way that rooms maintained by women of Lady Dorothea's generation are magnificent. Pale blue silk walls hung with miniature portraits in gilded frames, a white marble fireplace with a brass fender polished to a mirror finish, a glass-fronted cabinet of Chelsea porcelain arranged with absolute precision, and Lady Dorothea herself seated before the fire in a gown of deep violet wool, her silver hair dressed with the perfection of a woman who considers all appearances to be arguments. Tea was ordered. The maid withdrew. The door closed. The fire snapped once in its grate. They were alone for the first time, and the room, for all its beauty, for all its warmth and pale blue silk, felt to Evangeline exactly as it was, a room in which a confrontation had been waiting, for some considerable time, for both parties to arrive at once. Lady Dorothea made no pretense. This was the quality Evangeline had not expected and found herself, despite everything, respecting. That in private, stripped of the audience she performed for, the woman simply stated her position. There was no cruelty in her voice and no warmth either. There was only the calm, considered language of someone who has thought a matter through to its foundations and arrived at conclusions she considers both correct and necessary. She said that Constance had been understood by everyone of consequence to be the intended bride of the Duke of Ravenscroft for nearly 20 years. That this expectation had been discussed with Edmund's mother on multiple occasions, with mutual and genuine agreement. That when Edmund had returned from Yorkshire married to a governess without a settled fortune or an aristocratic connection, the injury inflicted was not merely personal but structural, a blow to an entire system of obligation and expectation maintained with great care and effort for generations. "I do not dislike you personally, Your Grace," Lady Dorothea said, with the exact temperature of someone who means precisely the opposite. She paused, then added something Evangeline had not anticipated. "I suspect, in another life, I might even have admired you. You have considerable qualities. It is your position I object to, not your character." The teacup in Evangeline's hand did not shake. She had prepared for hatred. Honest calculation, she found, was considerably harder to answer. She set down her cup with great care and said, in a voice that did not rise and did not waver and occupied the room with the quiet authority of someone who has decided that the time for indirection is finished, "I understand your position, Lady Dorothea. I do not accept it." She said that the social order Lady Dorothea described had survived marriages of genuine affection before this one, and would survive them again. That she had entered her marriage honestly, and had no intention of withdrawing from it to satisfy an arrangement she had never known existed and to which she had never been a party. She then said, and she watched Lady Dorothea's face with care as she said it, that she was aware of the payments made to the man at Cloth Fair who had constructed the crab fiction, and she wanted Lady Dorothea to know that she was aware, and that a full and dated account of everything that had occurred was being kept under legal seal by a named solicitor. The room changed temperature. It was subtle. Lady Dorothea's face did not move in any way that a stranger would have detected, but Evangeline was not a stranger, and she saw what passed through those composed blue eyes, not fear, but the precise internal adjustment of a strategist who has just been informed that the terrain is different from what she believed. "Then you shall have to be destroyed, Your Grace," Lady Dorothea said softly, after a pause. "I am genuinely sorry for it." She sounded, Evangeline thought, as though she was. She rose and walked toward the drawing-room door, and in the marble-floored hall beyond it she encountered Lord Phineas Wycliffe arriving for a morning call, dressed with perfect ease, gloves in hand, with the unhurried confidence of a man in a house he knows as well as his own. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. For 3 long seconds they stood in the cold light of the entrance hall, the fanlight above the front door throwing pale winter shapes across the floor between them, and neither spoke. Lord Wycliffe smiled at her then, the smile she had come to recognize as his most truthful expression. Pleasant, measured, and entirely devoid of concern, the smile of a man who believes with great confidence that events will resolve in only one possible direction. She held his gaze without expression and inclined her head and moved toward the door that the butler was holding. She was on the threshold when something made her glance upward. At the top of the staircase, half visible in the gallery above the hall, stood Constance Pelhamstoke in a morning dress of pale grey wool, looking down. When their eyes met, Constance did not smile. She did not look triumphant, or vindictive, or even neutral. Her face, from that distance and in that cold staircase light, carried an expression that Evangeline was not prepared for: shame. Pure, unguarded shame. The butler closed the door behind her. The cold street received her. She walked back to Belgravia thinking about Constance's face. By January of 1877, Evangeline had been Duchess of Ravenscroft for 17 months and had learned the precise texture of every variety of refined cruelty that polished society could deliver while maintaining the appearance of perfect civility. She had also learned to distinguish between the hostility that was designed, rooted in Lady Dorothea's deliberate campaign, and the hostility that was merely reflexive, the automatic conservatism of people who resist any change to the familiar order not from malice but from the settled comfort of things remaining as they are. The first variety was dangerous and required strategy. The second could, with time and patience and consistent evidence of character, be worn gradually away. She had made real progress on the second front. Mrs. Blanche Horsley had published 2 carefully sourced pieces in the Ladies' Magazine on the Duchess of Ravenscroft, one addressing her management of the estate's charitable accounts, one examining her work with the Bristol Orphan Fund, both documented, both impossible to dismiss as mere flattery, both reaching exactly the readership from which the most influential opinion was formed. The Marchioness of Wharfdale, who harbored a long and unspoken dislike of Lady Dorothea that she had been waiting 2 decades to act upon, had begun including the new Duchess in her Thursday afternoon call list. Small gains. Real ones. Each one a stone laid with care in the foundation of something that was beginning, slowly, to resemble an alternative ground. Lord Phineas Wycliffe called at Ashworth House on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of January, arriving precisely within the window between noon and 3 o'clock during which the Duke was invariably at Westminster attending the day's parliamentary business. Agnes had noted the time, because Agnes noted everything. He was shown into the morning room on the first floor, a pale room with flower-patterned paper and a rear window overlooking the winter garden, where the bare rose canes were tied against their iron frame and the gravel path lay white under overnight frost, and he rose when Evangeline entered with the fluid courtesy of a man in whom social graces had been installed so early and so deeply that he performed them without reference to his intentions. He said he had come to leave a card for the Duke, then made no movement toward the card dish in the hallway. He sat back. He accepted the tea Agnes brought. He waited with his pleasant, patient expression while Agnes withdrew, waited with the specific stillness of a man who has done this before and knows exactly how long the next few minutes will take. Then he began to speak, and the voice he used was not the voice he used in public. It was quieter, more direct. It had the texture of oak rather than silk, and it made her understand, not for the first time, that the pleasantness was not his character but his instrument. His character was something considerably colder. He told her the campaign against her, he used that word without embarrassment, campaign, had architects and that those architects could be persuaded to redirect their energies. He was, he said, in a position to be of material assistance to her in this regard. The price of his assistance was modest, her influence over Edmund in a matter before the Lords. A bill concerning railway land acquisition in the North Riding, specific acreage, specific ownership interests, which he listed with the ease of a man reciting figures he has memorized, was under consideration in the current session. Edmund had been resistant to the bill's passage. Wycliffe required that Edmund be persuaded to withdraw that resistance. He framed it as mutual advantage. He spoke of it as the rational resolution of a costly and unnecessary conflict. He noted that a woman of her intelligence would understand that the exhausting indefinite warfare of the current situation served no one's actual interests as well as a clean and private negotiated peace would serve them. He delivered the whole of it in the pleasantest voice imaginable, and she was conscious, for the space of 3 deliberate breaths, of the pull of it, the deep, animal tiredness of the fight, the seductive geometry of a door being held open. She let the 3 breaths pass. She set down her cup. She looked at him with the expression she had practiced in the mirror on Park Street in Bristol when she was 22 years old and learning what her face was capable of, absolute, impersonal calm. She told him no. She said it in the deliberate, exact manner of a woman who has considered the word carefully and chosen it with full understanding of its consequences, a no that left no space for renegotiation or reinterpretation, that filled the morning room the way a struck bell fills a corridor, completely and without remainder. She told him she would not speak to her husband about his parliamentary positions, now or at any future point, and that she would be grateful if he would take his leave. He did not move. For the first time in her acquaintance with him, the pleasant surface developed a fracture, not large, not dramatic, but real, like a hairline in good china that you see only because the light has shifted. He said, in a quieter register, that he had a regard for her mother, Mrs. Harriet Morrow of Park Street, Bristol. Number 14, Park Street, he said, with the specificity of someone reading from a document they have memorized. He said that the outstanding debts of the late Mr. Thomas Morrow, largely settled but not entirely resolved, might bear re-examination under certain conditions, and that certain creditors, if prompted by a concerned party, might find grounds to revisit the matter. The specificity of the house number, 14, entered her chest like cold water poured directly. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, then crossed to the bell pull and rang for the footman. Wycliffe adjusted his gloves, smiled the truest smile she had ever seen on his face, and departed. She sat at her writing desk long after the household had gone to bed, in the company of the dying fire and the cold glow of a single lamp, and she wrote 2 letters. The first to her mother on Park Street, warning her precisely and without alarm that she might receive unwanted callers or correspondence in the weeks ahead, advising her to admit no one unknown and to refer any creditor inquiries to a solicitor whose name and address she enclosed. The second to Sir Aldous Pemberton, setting out every detail of the afternoon's visit in full, Lord Wycliffe's proposition, the specific threat, the address spoken aloud, and requesting that Sir Aldous make a formal private record, dated and witnessed, to be held under seal. She sealed both envelopes, gave them to Agnes, and sat afterward at the empty desk for a considerable time, looking at the window where the January night pressed dark and cold against the glass. She thought of the address in Agnes's note. Clough Fair, Clerkenwell. She thought of Mr. Erasmus Quill. What Lord Wycliffe did not know, what none of them knew, was that she had not been waiting to act. She had already acted. 3 weeks prior, through Sir Aldous and a trusted private inquiry agent, she had located Erasmus Quill at his Clerkenwell premises and arranged, through careful intermediary, to know precisely what he had been commissioned to produce. She had been building the case in silence since December. She had, in effect, already won. She simply did not yet have the right moment to use it. The forged letter arrived in Lord Wycliffe's hands in the final week of February 1878, and he delivered it to Edmund at the Reform Club on a Thursday afternoon with a performance of reluctance so convincing that 3 members present later described him as having appeared genuinely and personally distressed. The letter was addressed in Evangeline's hand, or a hand so precisely constructed in reference to hers that only sustained familiarity with the original would have detected the difference. Its contents were a work of calculated malice. Written in the intimate register of a woman addressing a previous lover, the name deliberately omitted, it confirmed every accusation of the preceding 2 years, that her pursuit of the Duke had been strategic from the first, that her feeling for Edmund was the gratitude of a woman rescued rather than the love of a woman choosing, that she found the obligations of the dukedom tedious and the man himself considerably less rewarding than the elevation he represented. It was fiendishly effective because no single element was obviously impossible. There were no claims that could be definitively disproven. There were details about Ashworth House, the arrangement of the second-floor rooms, the particular height of the nursery window, the name of the head groom, that created in the document a sense of intimate knowledge. Too intimate. Evangeline, when she eventually read it, would recognize those details as things only someone inside the household could know. Someone with access. Someone named Hartwell. Edmund read it in a corner of the club's reading room with the Thursday afternoon light falling through the tall windows and the careful hush of the room around him, the rustle of newspapers, the low murmur of conversation, the steady tick of the bracket clock above the fireplace, all of it proceeding without knowledge or concern for the thing he was holding. He read it once from first word to last and then set it face down on the table and sat for a long time looking at the window, where the February sky was the particular flat pewter that London wears for weeks at the tail of winter. He thought of the library at Ravenscroft and the rolling ladder and the gibbon and the 4 evenings that had changed the geography of his entire adult life. He thought of Clara saying "Are you Uncle Edmund?" and of Evangeline's face in that moment, the way she had looked at him looking at the child, measuring him, and the quality of what he had subsequently understood about himself through her eyes. He thought of the proposal in the garden and the ivory rose and the absolute certainty of her yes. He thought of his own doubt after the crab rumour, the one day of doubt, the shame of it. He thought of Wycliffe's pleasant face. He thought of Sir Aldous. He set a coin on the table, stood, put the letter inside his coat, and walked out into the pewter afternoon. Something in him had broken. Something else, simultaneously, had become very clear. He came home to Ashworth House and he was courteous. He was attentive. He poured the sherry himself and inquired about her afternoon with the proper warmth of a man whose afternoon has been entirely unremarkable. But Evangeline had loved this man for 3 years and had watched him in every weather of his character, in the ease of his Yorkshire mornings and the tiredness of his London evenings, in the grief he carried quietly for his sister and her husband, in the precise quality of his silences after parliamentary sessions that had gone badly. She could read him. Something had happened since morning. She asked twice, gently, if anything troubled him. Twice he said he was merely tired from the session. She did not press. She understood that pressing would only drive whatever it was deeper, and she was not yet sure what it was. They sat across the dinner table and spoke with perfect civility about subjects that had nothing to do with what was actually present in the room, and the distance between them in that ordinary candlelit hour was wider and colder than anything Lady Dorothea had yet managed to manufacture. She lay awake that night and looked at the plasterwork ceiling in the dark and felt, for the first time since their wedding, genuinely and specifically afraid, not of the campaign against her, which she had strategies for, but of the possibility that the one person she needed to be unshakable had discovered, in a Thursday afternoon at his club, the exact location of his flaw. She found it the following morning. Edmund had gone early to Westminster and had left his study door unlocked, not carelessly, she would later think, but with the particular carelessness of a man in whom some unconscious part has decided that the discovery should happen. She entered to retrieve a volume he had borrowed from her shelves, and the letter was lying face down on the corner of his writing desk, weighted by the edge of the inkstand. She turned it over. She needed 30 seconds to understand what she was holding. She recognized the ghost of her own handwriting with the cold, immediate clarity of someone seeing their reflection altered in a way they cannot quite name. She read the letter through. She noticed the flatness of its feeling, the technically correct intimacy of a document produced by a skilled forger who had studied the surface of a relationship without understanding its interior. Then she reached the reference to the nursery at Ravenscroft, the height of the east window, the name scratched into the windowsill by some long-gone child, and the cold that moved through her was not fear. It was recognition. Only someone who had physically stood in that room could know that detail. Only a member of the household. She placed the letter back exactly as she had found it. She walked to the writing box in her sitting room, lifted the lid, and looked at the sealed letter from Sir Aldous that she had kept there since December, the one containing Erasmus Quill's full disclosure. She sat down. She thought of Mr. Arthur Hartwell, and of Agnes seeing him leave a meeting with Wycliffe, and of the specific way a man looks when he is carrying something inside his coat that he does not intend to declare. They attended the Royal Opera House at Covent Garden 2 days later for a production of Verdi's Othello, and in the great gilded foyer at the interval, the gaslights blazing gold above the crowd's slow formal circuit of display and observation, the smell of powder and cigar smoke and hothouse flowers and hot brass, Edmund stood 20 feet away with Lord Wycliffe and did not cross to her. He looked once, briefly, and without expression. She stood with Agnes at her elbow and the crimson and gold of the opera house enormous around her and the full murmuring weight of society's attention distributed between them, and she stood perfectly still, because any movement would have been a performance and she refused to perform. Mrs. Horsley found her at the 12-minute mark and spoke about the soprano with saving enthusiasm. The second half of the opera proceeded. Ego finished his work. Othello was undone by a lie he chose to believe. She returned to Ashworth House in the carriage beside Edmund in a silence that was the most painful thing she had sustained in 2 years, and before he woke the following morning she had Agnes begin packing the Yorkshire trunks. She took the first northern train. Before the carriage reached the station, she had already written and sealed a brief note addressed to a premises at Cloth Fair, Clerkenwell. The note asked Mr. Erasmus Quill to present himself, with every document in his possession relating to the commissions of 1876 and 1877, to Sir Aldous Pemberton at Gray's Inn at his earliest convenience, and to understand, clearly, that it was in his material interest to do so promptly. She stood in the rain outside the Grosvenor Square portico with the page from Agnes's glove in her wet hands and read it twice in the trembling light of the nearest gas lamp. It was torn from a memoranda notebook, the left edge bearing the rough mark of removal, and written in a controlled, educated hand that she had already, within the first 3 lines, recognized. The page was a set of instructions for the production of a forged letter in the hand of the Duchess of Ravenscroft, the required contents, the tone, the precise accusations to be included. Below the instructions, added in darker ink as a subsequent annotation, 2 entries. A name, Mr. Erasmus Quill, Cloth Fair, Clerkenwell, and a sum paid in coin, the date given as December the 3rd. The contents matched the letter Edmund had received at his club with an exactness that abolished coincidence. But it was not the contents that made her breath stop in the cold night air. It was the handwriting. She had seen this hand on 3 years of household correspondence, on appointment books and domestic accounts and messages delivered to her sitting room door. She had seen it every day of her London life without suspecting it of anything except diligence. The neat, controlled, professional hand of Mr. Arthur Hartwell, Edmund's private secretary, placed in Edmund's employ 3 years prior, placed there, she now understood with absolute and terrible clarity, before the marriage had even been proposed, by Lord Phineas Wycliffe. Agnes was at her side before she had taken 10 steps back through the portico doors, appearing with the silent promptness of someone who has been waiting in precisely this location for precisely this moment. She was damp from the rain and carrying her black wool cloak over one arm and wearing the expression she brought to matters of real weight, entirely still, entirely present, eyes sharp as the December light had never been. She explained in the efficient, unhurried manner she brought to all important communications, that the page had been sent to her 3 days prior, posted from Bristol in an unmarked envelope. The sender was her cousin Nora, employed as kitchen maid in the Pelhamstoke household at Grosvenor Square, who had found the page in the grate of Lady Dorothea's private writing room when the fire was being relayed one Tuesday morning, found it incompletely burned, half legible, the bottom third reduced to char but the upper portion intact and clearly significant. Nora had felt troubled. She had said nothing to anyone in the household. She had folded the page inside the letter she was posting to her cousin Agnes that same afternoon, without explanation, because she trusted Agnes to know what to do with such a thing, which, Agnes said, without inflection, she did. She had carried it to the ball in the pocket of her apron, pressed against her ribs, because she had judged with the accuracy that 3 years of vigilance produces that tonight would be the night it would be required. She moved through the ballroom crowd with the page held flat against the inside of her wrist until she located Sir Aldous Pemberton near the supper-room entrance, his sandy hair fully silver now above his formal collar, his expression wearing the contained neutrality he employed when watching events he finds both appalling and entirely predictable. She reached him and said his name. He looked at her face, read something in it, and gave her his complete attention. She offered him the page. He read it in the 35 seconds that a fast mind requires to process a document of that length and weight. He looked up. His expression had changed to something she had not seen in Aldous Pemberton in 20 years of observing him, full, undisguised shock. He said, with quiet force, "My God. Hartwell." She said, "Yes." He said, "How long have you known?" She said, "Since the nursery detail in the forged letter. The height of the east window. Only someone who had stood in that room." He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Edmund chose him himself. 3 years ago. Wycliffe recommended him." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "He absorbed this." He looked once at the ballroom, calculating distances and relationships with the rapid efficiency of a sailor reading wind and current simultaneously. "There is a magistrate present," he said. "Lord Hartington, near the east wall fireplace." She said, "I know. I positioned myself near him earlier this evening. I have been waiting for you." Aldous looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not quite amusement and not quite awe. 20 minutes, he said. He took the page. He crossed the room. Edmund had not been standing still. She had assumed he was somewhere in the ballroom performing the social endurance that the evening required, but he was not in the ballroom. He was in a narrow servants' corridor off the east hallway, a cold and functional passage with bare plaster walls and a flagstone floor, and he had been standing there alone since the moment she had left, because the moment she had left was the moment he understood what he had done. He had understood it in under 30 seconds. He had stood in that cold corridor with the sound of the ballroom muffled through the wall beside him and gone through it with the absolute honesty that he should have applied 2 years earlier, and he had not allowed himself to soften a single element of the conclusion he reached. It was his cowardice. His specific, named, inexcusable cowardice, the cowardice of a man who had been given 3 years of incontrovertible evidence of his wife's character and had still, in the space of one Thursday afternoon, allowed a man he knew to be untrustworthy to plant a seed that should have found no purchase. He crossed the ballroom floor the moment he saw her. He did not say anything rehearsed or measured. He said, "I am sorry. I should have spoken. I should never have been silent." She looked at his grey eyes and his jaw and the undefended expression on his face, the most unguarded she had ever seen it, stripped of every layer of ducal composure, simply a man presenting himself accurately, and she took his arm. "Then speak now," she said. "Tonight." Loudly. Edmund turned to face the ballroom and the conversation around them died with the particular completeness of a room that senses something consequential happening. His voice, when he spoke, filled the space with the unhurried authority of 12 years in the House of Lords, a voice built for exactly this purpose, shaped by precisely this kind of moment. He said that the letter read this evening by Lord Wycliffe was a forgery, produced for payment by a named individual at premises in Clerkenwell, commissioned through Lord Wycliffe by a principal whose identity was now known and documented. He said that evidence to this effect had been placed before a witness of legal standing this same evening. He named Mr. Arthur Hartwell, his own secretary, he said, his own appointed secretary, placed in his household 3 years ago on the recommendation of Lord Wycliffe, whom he had trusted, at a cost to his wife that he could not yet fully measure and that he named plainly as his own failure of judgment as much as anyone else's. He said that the Duchess of Ravenscroft was the most honourable person present this evening, or to his certain knowledge, any other evening of his adult life, and that his silence had been the only truly unsuitable element of their marriage, and that it was finished. The room was 300 people and absolute silence. Lady Dorothea Pelhamstoke descended one step of the grand staircase and stopped, and her face, for the first time in 62 years of absolute composure, showed something that had no ready name. And then, from the back of the room, moving through the crowd with the quiet, deliberate pace of a woman who has made a decision that will cost her, came Constance Pelhamstoke. She crossed the floor in her mother's full sight. She stopped beside Evangeline. She said nothing. She did not need to. She simply stood there, in the light of 300 candles, and the statement her presence made was a great deal louder than anything she could have spoken. The morning after the masquerade ball at Grosvenor Square was clear and bitter cold, the pavements white with night frost, the London sky a pale and washed-out blue that carried no warmth despite its clarity, and the newspapers moved through the story with the efficiency of institutions that have been waiting for something of precisely this nature. Mrs. Blanche Horsley had remained at the ball until the last carriage departed, had spoken to 11 witnesses, and had written her account in a single sitting that lasted until 3:30 in the morning, producing 600 words of documented precision that appeared in a special afternoon edition of the Ladies' Magazine with the title, A Fabrication Exposed. The Times followed with its own piece the following morning, drawing on a brief formal statement from Lord Hartington confirming that evidence of criminal fraud had been presented to him and that the matter was under review by the relevant authorities. The Morning Post ran a commentary that stopped carefully short of naming Lady Dorothea but which those acquainted with the matter understood entirely. By noon, the drawing-rooms of Mayfair had reversed their verdict on the Duchess of Ravenscroft with the seamless efficiency of weather vanes catching a changed wind. The same rooms that had enacted her social destruction simply pointed in the opposite direction without a word about the journey between positions, because drawing-rooms are expert at this, and always have been. The legal proceedings advanced with the purposeful speed of a matter that a magistrate has decided to take personally. Mr. Erasmus Quill of Cloth Fair had presented himself to Sir Aldous Pemberton at Gray's in 5 days before the ball, presented himself, as Sir Aldous would later note with dry admiration, with his documents already organized, because a man of his profession understands the comparative merits of disclosure versus prosecution with considerable clarity. His account was comprehensive. He named Lord Phineas Wycliffe as the commissioner of both the crab fiction and the forged letter. He provided dates, meeting locations, and payment records kept with the professional tidiness of a man who understood that his records were his sole insurance policy. He further confirmed that the specific household details required for the forgery, the nursery window, the groom's name, the domestic geography of Ashworth House, had been supplied to him in written notes in a hand he could identify. That hand was identified as Hartwell's. Mr. Arthur Hartwell was arrested on the Friday morning following the ball, in the rooms he kept in Chancery Lane, by 2 officers accompanied by Sir Aldous himself. It was Sir Aldous who later established, through the examination of employment records and correspondence, the fact that Wycliffe's recommendation of Hartwell had been made 3 years prior to the Duke's marriage, which meant that the secretary had been placed inside Edmund's household not in response to the marriage but in anticipation of the possibility of it. The planning had begun, it appeared, the moment Edmund first declined to reply to Lady Dorothea's letters. Lady Dorothea Pelhamstoke faced no criminal proceeding. The connection between the instructions on the burned page and her authorship was compelling but insufficient for prosecution, and her solicitor, excellent, experienced, entirely unfazed by difficult clients, ensured that no statement was made and no document produced. What destroyed her was not a courtroom. It was the drawing-rooms themselves, the same rooms she had managed with such expertise for 30 years, which turned from her now with the same indifferent mechanism by which they had once turned from Evangeline, the invitations that went unanswered, the morning calls that simply ceased to arrive, the particular smile now directed toward Lady Dorothea herself that she had spent 2 years directing toward the new Duchess. She left London for her Wiltshire estate before March ended and did not return that season. Lord Phineas Wycliffe had already departed the country by then, seen boarding a Channel ferry at Dover on a wet Thursday morning by a customs official who noted his unusual haste. He was not seen at his club again. In the first week of April, Evangeline received a letter from Constance Pelhamstoke, 3 short, careful sentences written in a composed and unsentimental hand. That Constance had known nothing of the scheme, that she was deeply sorry for its consequences, and that she wished the Duke and Duchess very well. Evangeline replied with equal brevity and with warmth she did not have to manufacture, because Constance was not a villain and had never been one. She had been a woman made into an instrument by someone else's ambition, and there was nothing in that condition that Evangeline could not understand. Edmund resigned from the Lord Select Committee on Northern Railway land acquisition 3 weeks after the ball, resigned voluntarily, without pressure, issuing a public letter that cited a conflict arising from recent events and the need to remove any question of external influence over his parliamentary conduct. It was a significant sacrifice. The committee position had represented 4 years of careful political capital, and the resignation was noted in the press with varying interpretations that ranged from principled to impetuous. Edmund made no comment on any of them. He made the resignation, he told Sir Aldous simply, because he wished there to be nothing in the structure of his public life that could be used to construct a story about his wife's influence over his judgment, and because he wanted, more urgently than he had ever wanted any political advantage, for there to be no question remaining. Sir Aldous had read the resignation letter in silence, folded it, and sat for a moment with the particular expression he wore when he was forming a sentence he considered important. Then he said, quietly, without preamble, in the tone he used for information he had been carrying for some time and had decided it was finally the right moment to deliver, "I should perhaps have told you sooner. Your mother wrote to me in the last year of her life. She said, and I am quoting her directly now, because you deserve the exact words, she said that when you eventually found someone worth choosing over all the sensible arrangements, she hoped you would choose without hesitation." He paused. "She would have adored Evangeline. I am entirely certain of it." Edmund said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I know," he said. "I have always known." The last scene is a Sunday morning in June at Ravenscroft Manor, when the lime trees on the long avenue are in their deepest, most generous green and the air through the open library windows smells of warm stone and newly cut grass and the first roses of the season opening on the south wall, and the morning light falls through the old amber panes in the particular color of late honey, warm and without apology. Evangeline is on the rolling library ladder, the same room, the same shelves extending into the same light that had begun everything 3 years before, reaching for a volume she has been intending to reread since winter, her left hand steadying herself against the shelf while her right fingers find the spine she has been looking for. The house is quiet in the way that it is quiet on June Sunday mornings. Amelia is somewhere in the park with her sketchbook and her increasingly impressive opinions about natural history, Clara is in the garden with the new litter of spaniel puppies, and Mrs. Thorpe is overseeing the kitchen preparations for the afternoon with the serene authority of a woman who has seen every variety of household crisis and regards them all as problems of logistics. Edmund comes in with the Morning Post and 2 cups of tea, and he sets them on the central table without ceremony, and he looks up at her on the ladder with an expression so private and unguarded that she feels it across the room before she has turned to see it. She descends 3 rungs, not to the floor, just far enough to be level with him where he sits. He passes the tea without a word. The morning holds them in its amber light. The nation had been shocked, and had gossiped, and had judged, and then reversed its judgment with the brisk efficiency it brought to all verdicts. But what it would remember, if it chose, in time, to be truthful with itself, was not the scandal and not the names of those who fell. It would remember a young woman who walked out into the London rain in an ivory gown drenched in someone else's wine, who read one small piece of paper in the dark, and who walked back through the door. It would remember that she was already holding the evidence. It would remember that she had been ready for some time. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below, we read every single one. Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments. And if you have not yet subscribed to the Duke's Shadow, do so now, and never miss another Victorian romance that will break your heart and put it back together again. Like, subscribe.